Hello, my name is Joshua Long. I'm the author of Avenging Child Sex Abuse, Vigilante Violence in Prisons in the Community. My co-author is Jason Vukovich, who is currently incarcerated in Alaska. And our intentions with this book was to discuss the phenomenon of people taking the law into their own hands to get justice in crimes where children were abused, especially crimes where children were sexually abused, because these crimes provoke very extreme reactions in society. And it seems like the justice system is failing in its basic responsibilities to take these crimes seriously, to hold offenders accountable. And so some people become vigilantes. And it's even a phenomenon not just in society, but inside jails and prisons, where people convicted of crimes go out of their way to punish people, add to the punishments of other convicted felons who are serving time for child sex abuse crimes. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and it's one that has sort of taken over the internet in recent years. So we wanted to give a one-stop source for as many aspects of vigilantism, the justice system, child abuse, trauma, all in one place, so that people can have a resource to go to help understand why it is some people are so outraged by these crimes and the justice system's failure to act, that they're willing to risk their own freedom in order to get justice. What I did to conduct the research for this book is I did data analysis, I did news media case analysis. I also got my hands on a lot of original documentation from courts, pre-sentence investigations, and murder investigations that happen inside prisons and places. And then I also spoke directly to vigilantes. So I've had a list of people who'd committed crimes, that they were being praised in society as heroes for their actions. And I went and interviewed them, their family members, and sometimes victims of crimes, to see their point of view. Some of the information I got may not be entirely reliable. One thing is, in the social sciences, is we rely on people's statements to draw a lot of conclusions from. We use that as raw material to conduct analyses and things, but it doesn't mean they're telling the truth. So the way I think of it as, it's verbal justifications for crime. It's people describing their motivations. This crime in particular, vigilantism, has a heroic dash to it, so that some people may be inclined to exaggerate or lie about their motives in order to seem more heroic. And this is a problem for me, but it's not something I can easily fix. When people told me stories, I tried to confirm, I looked it up, tried to gather evidence, and sometimes they were found to be not lying. It's hard to say someone's telling the truth, but you can find when somebody is told a lie, usually. But sometimes it was impossible. For example, many of the people I interviewed had been reported being sexually abused when they were children, and no reports were made to the police. It happened decades ago, behind closed doors. How could I possibly know what actually happened to them? And that's where we get this issue of believability. But I think that there was quite a lot of good information I gathered from these interviews that's still worth considering. And its implications for society and the legal system are really profound. Before I go any further, I want to talk about Andrew Vax, who was an attorney and an author and an activist in New York. And he worked with children his whole life. He wanted to help children and who'd been the victims of sexual abuse and other types of abuse and neglect. And he was actually the warden of a juvenile detention center in Massachusetts. And while he was there, he talked to kids who were young, violent, dangerous kids. And a lot of them were reckless, out of control, joined a gang, killed somebody. And they were dangerous kids. And he interviewed them, and he found a common theme among the most violent people, the most violent life course, violent juveniles that he interacted with, is that they had been abused and neglected as kids, and a lot of them had been sexually abused. And the trauma of your early childhood experiences can have devastating impact on your trajectory through life. So Andrew Vax wrote a lot about this. He actually wrote more than 30 fiction books where, based on true stories and people he knew, he was able to bring to life the vigilante motive. So a lot of the characters in his books would go and murder a sex offender, and they would just shoot him in the head. They blow him up. They would go through all these assassination techniques to kill him. And he wasn't endorsing vigilantism. He was expressing the tragedy from the point of view of the vigilante, these traumatized, beaten down, outcasts from society who don't trust anybody except other people like themselves, which he called the children of the secret. And that there are all these children around the world who grow up to become adults. What happens to them? Some of them who are abused get over it. They are survivors. They move on with their lives. Others are transcenders. They get jobs as counselors and lawyers, and they try to make the world a better, safer place. They transcend their abuse to try to save others. But there are some people who never get over it, who never turn it into something good. And they end up in our prisons. They become self-destructive. And then sometimes they destroy other people. He wanted to see what would happen in his fiction stories if they targeted the people who actually abuse kids. So in a way, they're trying to transcend their abuse by killing people who abuse children. And it's really incredible series of books. You should look up his whole catalog of books he's written. A couple that I highly recommend is one is A Bomb Built in Hell. There's one named Shella. And then there's the Burke series, but the best one in the Burke series is Sacrifice. So if you could read those books, you'd get a really good idea of what Andrew Vax was trying to do. So throughout my book, I keep referring back to Andrew Vax, his life's work, his fiction work, his nonfiction work, and his activism, because I felt like he had a really good model for understanding this, which is the bomb built in hell. The idea that someone's life is so tragic and terrible that it culminates in violence against others, which is something we should all be interested in, even if you're one of these people who doesn't have empathy for the child victim, which sadly, in my research, I found some people that make excuses for the offender and not the child. Even in that case, you'd have to say that these children grow up and what happens to them is devastating for society. Our prisons are full of people who are abused as children. This is a popular debate. If you look at American media, comic books, cartoons, television, movies, you will see thousands of examples of a vigilante who takes the law into their own hands in order to make the government look bad. They want to obviously reduce crime. They pull out a gun. This is Charles Bronson in the Death Wish movies. He just goes around shooting people. The cops won't do it. He'll do it himself. And this really fits into what is called the American, the myth of the American superhero. That every cowboy movie, you ever watch a cowboy movie where John Wayne goes around and has a shootout with the bad guy? Why doesn't he call the sheriff? Well, because the sheriff can't do anything. The sheriff's corrupt or incompetent, and the bad guys are too tough and everyone's too scared. But a lone American hero can stand up and kill and solve the problem. They're dead. You killed the bad guy. And this, I think, is sort of the backdrop, and it's maybe part of the allure of the vigilante that is the reason why you see so many memes on the internet supporting vigilantism. Most people, if you sat down and said, do you really think people should go around with guns killing criminals, suspected criminals, alleged criminals? They're going to say no. We want due process. You know, even there's a lot of people who are found guilty of crimes they didn't commit. So even the justice system is flawed. Why should we trust individuals? But we also just want to solve the problem. Why is the government, why is the police and the courts so terrible at taking these issues seriously, especially when children are involved? It makes us angry. And this is an expression of our hatred of people that hurt children. So one of the first people I interviewed was Stephen Sanderson. And for a few years, me and Stephen wrote letters back and forth. We talked on the phone. A lot of this happened during COVID, so I didn't get to meet him in person, but he was in a maximum security prison, so it would have been probably impossible anyway. But Stephen Sanderson is a guy who is famous on the internet because of a confession video that he made. So he's taken to an interrogation room because he murdered his cellmate, Ted Dyer. He goes into the interrogation room. This is a screenshot from it. He's sitting there at a desk, and a detective is asking him questions like, why'd you kill Ted Dyer? And Stephen Sanderson says, I killed him because he's a child molester. He got what he deserved. And he just bluntly says that killing sex offenders is good. And he's not sorry at all. Well, this is an expression of people's hatred and loathing of sex offenders that Steven Sanderson is famous. Here's a guy who murdered his girlfriend. He's already a murderer. He's serving life in prison. He's been a complete drain on society his entire life, in and out of prison, crime, stealing cars, burglary. He's told me himself, he's like, I'm a terrible person. I never belong outside of a prison. He told me he does not want to be released from prison because he'd be a threat to society. He told me he's not a good guy. I believe him. But while he's sitting in a prison cell, he murders a sex offender. Now people love him and they're writing him letters and they say, thank you. You've done community service. I hope they let you out early for good behavior because you killed a sex offender. And there's so many interesting things if you watch this video. If you watch it and you're just disgusted that this murderer is being lionized, then you're probably someone who hates vigilantes. If you're watching it and you're laughing, as the detective does in the interrogation, the detective is laughing and nodding his head and chuckling the whole time, then you probably support vigilantism to a certain extent. You might not want to pass a law that says it's okay to kill people, but you're willing to laugh when a sex offender is murdered because it makes you happy. It feels like justice to you. Now, this is one of the most fascinating Rorschach tests imaginable. If I held up an ink blot and said that you should, tell me what you see, and one person sees a butterfly and someone else sees two people fighting, that tells you a lot about the person. I mean, I don't know if that's actually valid, psychologically, but this definitely is valid because if you watch this video and you are outraged that Steven Sanderson thought that it was appropriate to take a human life, then you have a totally different set of moral values than the people who write Steven letters. Now, Steven sent me a box of letters that he got in the mail. I would never reveal anybody's names or anything that's in there, but they wrote some really heartbreaking stuff. They said, thank you, Steven. When you killed this guy, you showed through your actions that you will do something about this. Whereas everybody in my life has never done anything. The courts let me down. I was abused as a kid. My family let me down. Everybody's so worthless, but you're a hero because you took action. That's really sad because now my focus goes not from the vigilante, but to these traumatized victims. So in talking to Steven, he revealed to me some really in-depth background on his life when he was a child. He drew this picture and mailed it to me. And this is a picture of Steven, a self-portrait of what he said occurred to him in 1974 when he was about 10 years old. And he says he was kidnapped, taken to a basement by some strangers, and they filmed child pornography of him while abusing him. And you can see on his body, there's bruises where they grabbed him and jerked him around, where they put cigarettes out on his body. He said they put thumbtacks in his skin and they just tortured him. And then one day they let him go. And the reason the guy said he didn't kill him, the reason he let him go instead of killing him, is he said that he had broken his spirit and that he was dead inside. Now, is this a true story or not? Well, Steven gave me a lot of background information on this. I tried to confirm it. I couldn't find any records that he had been kidnapped as a kid. But then again, this was the 70s. There wasn't, they're not going to publish the name of a kid, who's found in the streets of Detroit. So I don't know. But there were a lot of cases of child kidnappings back then, child murders. There were active, what they called child pornography rings operating in the area in Detroit in the 70s. And these types of crimes do happen. I was a caseworker in a rural county in Ohio, and even in a rural county, away from a big city like Detroit, you will still find stuff like this happening. It's usually the parents who do it to their own children. It could also be people who are within the circle of trust of a child, like a preacher, a priest, a basketball coach, a karate instructor, a baseball coach, and teachers. So they work their way into a child's circle of trust the very few number of adults that a kid interacts with, and the kid is told to obey your elders, trust the adults, and these kids are then horribly abused, shamed, stigmatized, told that it was their fault, said they're threatened with physical violence if they tell anyone, they're threatened, their families are threatened, and all the different ways that children are manipulated to stay quiet and blame themselves has devastating psychological impact. So in Stephen's case, what he expressed to me was he has all these mental health symptoms. And what it aligns with pretty well is a thing called dissociative identity disorder. It's not multiple personality disorder like a lot of people think. What it is that when he was being abused, his child mind, being unable to escape from this horrifying event, would sort of go to another place. He would imagine that he was somewhere else, just pretend it's not happening. And what he would do is imagine he was in the woods. Well, as an adult, he tells me he sits in solitary confinement because he's murdering people in prison. He's in solitary. He sits there all the time and he imagines he's in the same woods. He calls them the dark woods, and he can retreat there in his mind. This is pretty similar to what we see in a lot of the psychiatric research on dissociative identity disorder, although Stephen himself has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So he doesn't seem to have any of the symptoms of schizophrenia, but that's what he's diagnosed with. So maybe it's a misunderstanding. I don't know. But I do know that the effects of child sexual abuse are horrible, the trauma that it inflicts. But one thing I do in the book is I go down through the list of adverse childhood experiences and the scientific research on how it affects children's behavior in regards to drug abuse, alcohol, either promiscuous sexual relationships and risky behaviors, or isolating yourself, not having any relationships, and how it impacts their ability to trust others and to trust the justice system or a therapist who let them down when they were kids, and how this compounds to the point that they end up in prison. And then they're sitting in a prison cell, serving 10 years for stealing a car to fuel their heroin addiction, and their cellmate is a child rapist serving 3 years or 18 months or less. And they get very angry. Does it surprise you that they lash out with violence? It shouldn't, but I had to spell it out very clearly in the book. In chapter 3, I go through a list of vigilante crimes, and I go down through some of the more popular, famous cases like Gary Plauché and all that. But one person I got to interview was James Fairbanks in Nebraska. So this happened not too long ago, only about 3 years ago. And James is the guy in the orange there on the left. And he was recently divorced, had nothing to live for, hated himself, kind of suicidal. And he was informed that a man in the neighborhood was harassing children. So James finds the guy. He's very distinctive. His name was Matteo Condalucci. That's the guy here with the glasses and the handlebar mustache. Turns out that Condalucci had been released from prison early, that he was labeled as a dangerous sex offender, and that it was requested many times through the sheriff's department that the sheriff's department said they wanted him to be locked up because he was a dangerous sex offender who was not amenable to treatment. He was a threat to society. But the courts overturned that and they released him. So he's on the sex offender registry. He's living in the neighborhood, and allegedly he's harassing children, like coming up to them while they're riding their bicycles, touching them. He would watch them, pretend to wash his car while the kids are out playing. So when James heard about this, he decided he was going to be a hero. If he's going to die, he might as well, do something good with his life. He might as well make the world a better place. So he goes up to Condalucci and shoots him 7 times with a rifle and murders him, then turns himself in. Another guy here is Jay Maynor, and this is a different type of vigilante. So in the book, I try to distinguish between different motives. In James's case, you have a guy who wants to do something for the world. He fits the vigilante motif of someone who's trying to be a hero and commits a felony to get there. In the other case, you have Jay Maynor, who was a father whose daughter was abused. He knew that the guy who abused his daughter, who was a family member, was living in the neighborhood. Went to prison, got out, and was living down the street. And for years and years, he saw that his daughter was suffering with the trauma of her abuse. He trusted the legal system to take care of it. He's a good citizen, but it was eating away at him. And then one day, he had an argument with his daughter. She said something about him, and he said, fine, I'm going to go take care of this like I should have years ago. And in an impulsive, angry moment, takes a gun, goes down and kills the guy who'd abused his daughter years before. Now he's serving life in prison. So here you have two different types of motives. The hero who's throwing away his life rationally, and the guy who's trying to fulfill an emotional part of his life, that he feels like he's not a good father until he does this thing. So the father, or even the mother, who this happened in a few cases with women, who lashes out to get revenge. Two different motives for the same thing that the newspapers call vigilantism. The most famous case of all was obviously Gary Plauché. Gary is the guy in the white hat with the sunglasses, and he's lifting a gun in that picture. He's about to shoot a guy in the head. The man he's going to shoot is Jeff Doucette, who was a man who had kidnapped and raped his little boy. And Gary got revenge. So every year on Father's Day, memes go all over the internet. Gary Plauché is Father of the Year. Be like Gary, that kind of stuff. Well, the guy you see on the right there is Jody Plauché. He wrote a book about it. And because that was his father, he was the kid who was kidnapped and abused. And he wrote about it. He became actually a great caseworker for kids. He became a victim's advocate. And he went around the country helping kids. He worked near Philadelphia. He would go and help little children. And he would use his story to say, listen, don't be scared to talk about this. It's so important for adults to know how to protect your kids, how to warn your kids about the signs that they're being groomed, how to warn them how to be safe, but most importantly, to let kids know that they shouldn't be ashamed and scared, that they can report, because so many of these crimes go unreported. So Jody Plauché turned his life into an amazing career of helping victims. And I think that's an overlooked part of the case. People talk about the Gary Plauché meme of him shooting a guy. And by the way, he got community service as his punishment for murder. But people said, why does he have to do community service? He's already done it. Another interesting case that is not mentioned very often, even in the true crime world, is Michael Allen Mullen. Michael Mullen, Washington State, had been abused as a kid, sexually abused. He grew up, drugs, went to jail, feeling really depressed, suicidal, and he said, well, if I kill myself, what good does it do? What can I do for the world before I leave, before I kill myself? And he decided he was going to be an Andrew Vax style hero. He was a fan of Andrew Vax. He wrote letters to the author. Now, Andrew Vax, like I said before, is a guy who wrote books about vigilantes. Vigilantes who go undercover and kill sex offenders, shoot them in the head, cold-blooded, psychopathic, but boiling with rage inside from the trauma of their own abuse. Michael wanted to do that. So he bought a uniform that would indicate that he was an FBI agent. He had a hat that said FBI. He's wearing like a boiler suit. And he walks up to a house where he looked up on a sex offender registry. There were 3 sex offenders living together, which, because of sex offender registry requirements, is often the case. They have to be roommates with each other. So Michael Allen Mullen goes inside. He tells them, listen, guys, I'm from the FBI, and I'm here to tell you there's a vigilante on the loose, and he's out trying to kill sex offenders. Now, these guys had no idea. They're like, whoa, really? He's like, yeah, there's a vigilante out there. You got to be really careful who you open your door to. He's the vigilante. You know, this is like true crime material. I don't know why people haven't picked up on this story, but so Mullen, he's got this gun. You know, he's an FBI agent, right? He's got this gun, and he asks each of the men, he's like, so do you feel sorry for what you did? And the first guy says, blames the victim. Second guy blames the victim. The third guy says, yeah, I am sorry for what I did. You know, I wish I'd never committed those sex crimes. So Mullen says, all right, you can leave. And the third guy leaves, but he's going to have another conversation with the other 2 guys. And as soon as the third guy leaves, Mullen shoots them both dead, just blows them away. He turned himself in. He might have been able to get away with it, or at least kill a few more people, but it seems like whatever emotional turmoil he was going through was expended in this double homicide. He'd never killed anyone before. He's a non-violent offender up to that point. So he turns himself in, and everybody was shocked. They're like, he's so nice. We thought he was going to be this bloodthirsty assassin. He's such a nice guy. But they gave him a life sentence anyway. He goes to prison. And then while he's in prison, he looks around and he realizes there's a lot of sex offenders in prison. And he wanted to kill them all. So he came up with another idea based off a story written by Andrew Vax, that he wanted to put rat poison in their food. So you go to the canteen where you can buy candy bars. He was going to inject it with rat poison. So he goes to the library, he gets a chemistry book out, he figures out what all chemicals he needs, and he makes friends among all the other prisoners. And he tells them, hey, buddy, you're going to be released soon, right? When you get out, I want you to send me these drugs in the mail, these like cyanide and all these ingredients I need to make my rat poison so I can kill sex offenders. So now he has like basically an army of guys who are going to get out of prison and send him contraband drugs so that he can kill people. And it turned out, though, that it didn't work. Either they got intercepted or the guys never sent him in or something. But he did get his hands on some drugs, which he used himself to commit suicide with. So he never did get to do that job of poisoning the sex offenders in prison. But one of the guys that he convinced that this was a good idea was Patrick Drum. So same county, same state, same time period. Patrick Drum gets out of prison. He's looking around for the cyanide or whatever, but Michael Mullen killed himself. So he's like, oh, well, that plan's ruined. Patrick Drum really wanted to kill sex offenders. He really wanted to. He's like, Michael Mullen was a hero, but why did he give up? He could have killed so many more. He only killed 2. So Patrick Drum started his own vigilante campaign. He found 2 guys that he actually personally knew, and he knew the victims. One guy he moved in with, who was a sex offender, and killed him. Then he went to the house of another sex offender and killed him. And he got those 2 murders, and the police arrested him. So it's not so easy to kill more than 2 people. In fact, I never found a single vigilante that killed more than 2. But Patrick Drum killed 2. And as he's going to court, they found he had with him a list with the names and addresses of 60 sex offenders that he was going to hunt down one at a time and murder. So this is people logging into the internet using the sex offender registry and Google Maps and MapQuest to find people's addresses so he can murder them. When he gets to court, the judge says, "We do not tolerate vigilantism." And Patrick Drum stood up and said, "This country was founded on vigilantism." And the courtroom was divided in 2 groups. One group was cheering for Patrick Drum. He's a hero. Let him go. And the other half was saying, "You're a monster. You're a murderer." So this goes back and forth. Hero or devil? What is a vigilante to you? Is he a monster or is he a hero? Our society is actually divided on this in very strong terms. Writing this book was the most controversial thing I've ever done. I usually lay low. I don't get involved in controversy. I am in it up to my neck now because I'm surrounded on the one side by people sending me emails saying, "How dare you write a book about vigilantes, humanizing vigilantes, trusting vigilantes? Don't you know that you're supporting horrible crimes against pedophiles who are oppressed minority in our country?" And then I get emails from other people who say, "How dare you write a book criticizing vigilantes? Do you want them? Do you want these sex offenders to prey on our children?" I'm like, I'm just caught in the middle. How dare I even study this? It's like the Civil War. I highly recommend you read an article in The Atlantic by a journalist named Lexi Pandel. She wrote an article about Patrick Drum, and she did incredible research on it. And it was called the Vigilante of Clallam County, and she describes the same thing. So when I talk to Patrick Drum, he's not really interested in talking about his crime anymore. Lexi Pandel really told the story perfectly. What he's interested in, though, are sentencing laws. He's very angry that people don't understand how the sentencing practices are set up to punish people for drug crimes worse than sex offenses. And partly I didn't believe him. I was like, what are you talking about, Patrick? Clearly, this is a serious felony to commit a sex crime against a child. And he said, look up the California statutes. And he gave me the names and the numbers of all the codes. And he says, look how child sex trafficking gets half the sentence of adult sex trafficking. Look at how they've eliminated in California the felony statute penalties for sodomizing a 12-year-old. And I was like, that can't be true. And I looked it up, and it was true. There are huge legal loopholes in the protection of children from sex crimes in every state in the country. And just to give you a brief summary to this, I wrote a chapter in the book where I go in depth on the problems in sentencing and the problems with the entire legal system. Let's just go through the numbers because it's very complicated. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, when you interview people who are over the age of 12, so we have no idea how many people under the age of 12 are raped. 459,000 people over the age of 12 are estimated to be raped in the year 2019. 500,000 people. It's just unbelievable. We have no idea how many children under the age of 12 are raped because they're so controlled by their parents that the parents are probably the ones doing the abusing. They're not going to hand them the telephone for a survey. So we have no idea how many sex crimes actually happen, but it's a huge number. 66,000 rapes were reported to the police, according to the Uniform Crime Report of 2019. That's only 14% of the total number of rapes were actually reported to the police. A lot of people don't report because they're scared. They're also afraid, they blame themselves. They're afraid of being stigmatized. And a lot of them don't think the system's going to do any good. Why go through all that? Why torture myself? People say that going to court is the second rape. You get raped, then you go to court, and you get raped again by the system. That's how they talk about it. This is blunt language by victims to describe the court process. The process that's supposed to help them is a process that punishes them. 22,000 of those rape crimes will result in a prison sentence. So about 5% of rape crimes result in a prison sentence, according to the National Corrections Reporting Program. This does not include crimes that were pled down from rape to lesser charges. And 98% of rape crimes involve a plea deal. Only 2% of people are found guilty in a court of law by a jury. That is, 98% of people are given a plea bargain, which I'll describe in a minute. The median time served in 2016 was 4.2 years. That means 50% of people served less than 4.2 years, and 50% of people who were sent to prison served more than 4.2 years. This does not account for the number of charges. So a guy who was convicted of 20 rapes might get life. He's factored into this average here too. Alongside a guy who had one count of rape. And so it was his first offense and it was a family member. All this stuff is combined together. This is national statistics. It doesn't tell you about individual cases. But what I was informed when I wrote this book is that it is apparently, I was unaware, it is the academic consensus that we overpunish rape crimes, that 4.2 years is too much time in prison, that they need less time in prison. Or sometimes they need no prison. And remember, 95% of them don't get punished at all. They get away with it. So this 5% who get punished are over-punished. And then, so what happened was in the year 2018, the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimated that they served 7.2 years. And there has been a slight increase in the amount of punishment over time. So if you look, they are taking rape crimes, sex crimes more seriously as the time goes by, which is causing now activists to say that we're over punishing sex offenders. So I actually got my hands on all the data from the National Corrections Reporting Program, and I estimated the amount of time served, the median, the mean, the mode, for every type of sex crime. And I looked across states, and what I found is it was 4.2 years That 7.2 was a spike. It was just like an anomaly year. 4.2 is the median time served across most states. Some states are more lenient than others. It looks like Nevada has the least serious punishments for rape and lewd sexual acts with a child. And Georgia has the most severe punishments. You can get about 12 years is the median for Georgia. To understand plea bargaining, I highly recommend these two books, Sex Crimes Then and Now by Alice Vax, who was a prosecutor. And what she found as a prosecutor, who was pretty much hounded out of her career because she rocked the boat, is that prosecutors collaborate with defense attorneys to help rapists get off the hook. They want them to be released from prison early. And you say, the prosecutor's the tough guy. The prosecutor is supposed to be punishing them. Why would the prosecutor ever help a rapist get back on the street? And she found lots of reasons. The first one is prosecutors are busy. They don't have time for a jury trial. So they just want you to plead guilty, and they will take any plea deal just to move on to the next case. The second reason was that prosecutors actually get credit based on the number of convictions. They're trying to keep their numbers up. If they go to trial, there's a possibility that they won't win. So they would rather have 98% of rape crimes pled down in what she calls a fish market haggling scheme, where the prosecutor's like standing there in these backroom deals, and he says, okay, so your guy raped 5 women, plead guilty to 1 rape. And the defense attorney says, no, we don't want rape on his record. We don't want him to be a sex offender. So have him plead to burglary and assault. And you're like, yeah, but he raped these 5 women. Well, just have him plead guilty to assault. He's been in jail for 6 months. Let him have time served and give him probation. I mean, after all, he's a war veteran. And they work together to help the rapist get set free. She exposed this back in the 80s, but she updated it for the 2010s. Same thing still going on. I highly recommend that book. That'll tell you how things really happen behind the scenes. You're not going to trust prosecutors ever again after you read that book. The other one is Punishment Without Trial. It's a brand new book by Carissa Byrne-Hessick. Incredible book that explains how plea bargaining is used to make people plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit. Now, that's bad for all crimes, especially bad for sex crimes. So you got someone, you're like, you overcharge them. You say, I'm going to give you 1,000 years in prison. You're definitely going to be found guilty. And unless you plead guilty to 1 crime, and you get 2 years in prison. So given the choice, do you really want to run the risk? You just serve your 2 years and you'll be over with, even for crimes you didn't commit. However, she has a chapter in here about how sex crimes are pled down, how a prosecutor will charge someone with breaking and entering into a house, charge them with assaulting someone, and it looks like they're a burglar. And you say, oh, it's a property crime that got out of hand, and you can make 1,000 excuses for a burglar. Turns out he broke into a house and raped a woman, but he was never charged with rape because he pled guilty to a crime he didn't commit, which was punching somebody in the face or something like that. It's actually, she actually got some secret inside information from an Ohio Supreme Court justice who gave her some, like a secret envelope of cases where these loopholes were used to get sex offenders off the hook. So that's the greatest book I've ever read in regards to this tragedy of our justice system, of the plea bargaining system. So there's a big moral divide. Like I said, there is an academic tendency to say that we overpunish, to look at the side of the rapist point of view. Is the rapist suffering? Is prison bad for him? There is that tendency. But the majority of people in society say they're not punished enough. And when it comes to vigilantism, there are some wild ideas out there. So yeah, if you look at a video of vigilantes on YouTube, you're going to get about 90% of the comments supporting vigilantism. And the other 10% say vigilantes are wrong. They can't take the law into their own hands. This is very common. But the meme culture is fascinating. So on the left here, you see the pedophile treatment center. It's a wood chipper, Chippy the wood chipper. And so they want to put them inside and chop up their bodies. They say that's a good way to treat them. And then Gary Plauché, like I said, has become a meme. What are your thoughts on this whole pedophile thing? My thoughts. So there's a big difference. And I think that part of the moral divide is actually goes down to people's moral foundations, which is slightly linked to politics. It's linked to your outlook on life, your family relationships. And the terms they use are conservative versus liberal. You should read a book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Really explains moral foundations theory. But what I found in my research is you have a group of people that feel very strongly that child sex abuse crimes are disgusting. They're evil, they're harmful, they're hurtful, and they're disgusting. And the disgust overrides their ideas about the rule of law, following the authorities, doing what you're told, conformity. And they say, I'll kill him, just throw him in a wood chipper, kill him. So they love vigilantes. And those are conservatives, very high disgust levels, very high disgust sensitivity. And they used to be very high on authoritarianism, trusting the government, and that's really dropped. So conservatives nowadays are more libertarian, and that's why they want the cowboy hero vigilante to take care of business. Liberals, which doesn't necessarily mean liberal like, Democrat or whatever, but liberal in the sense that you're very high on equality. Your sense of equality is really bothered anytime somebody is otherized or ostracized or stigmatized. It makes you feel bad. And that's why a lot of liberals can go out of their way to feel sorry for people who break the law, prisoners, criminal offenders. And what's interesting is they don't feel that way about vigilantes. All of a sudden, a vigilante sparks their sense of authoritarianism. They say, how dare you violate the law? Trust the law, trust due process, trust the courts. Why would liberals say that? They used to be the low authoritarianism, but actually it's their sense of equality is so violated by the idea of private citizens taking the law into their own hands that they equate vigilantism with fascism. Fascists are oppressing pedophiles. They feel sorry for sex offenders, people convicted of sex crimes. They feel sorry for minor attracted persons. And they go really far out of their way to create a mascot group or a group that they can defend. And they found this one taboo group that everybody else hates. And for some reason, people very high on a sense of equality want pedophiles, even offending pedophiles, the ones that actually hurt children, not just the ones who are attracted and don't do anything, but the ones who actually hurt kids. They feel sorry for them and want to protect them from society. It's fascinating. You get into like all the sociologists, the French philosophers like Foucault and all these guys who've been talking about this for 60, 70 years, how pedophilia should be, we should lower the age of consent and we should protect them. It should be a hate crime to be a vigilante. How can you have such a moral divide? It goes back to your moral foundations. How you think about these things it's like a Rorschach test. One guy who did a lot of research on vigilantism is Paul Robinson. Very interesting guy, law professor in Pennsylvania, UPenn. And he came up with 10 rules for vigilantes. If you're going to be moral when you go out and try to make the world a better place, you better follow some basic rules. You should contact the government first. You should try every possible alternative. You shouldn't work alone. It's not about you. You shouldn't brag about it. You shouldn't have collateral damage, and stuff like that. And he's a lawyer. So that's what he thinks of it in terms of laws. But so I applied his rules to two cases. One was Clark Fredericks. Clark had been reported being sexually abused by a Boy Scout leader when he was 12 years old. Horrifically sexually abused. Ruined his life. He turned to drugs and alcohol, gambling addiction. And when he's an adult, he's like 40 years old, he just snapped. He said, I want revenge. So he sharpened a hunting knife, went to the guy's house and stabbed him to death. Brutally killed him. But when he went in front of the courtroom, he told everybody his story. And he said, this is what I did. I had to do it. And I'm traumatized. And he cried. And the courtroom applauded. They thanked him. So the prosecutor felt bad. He didn't want to give him life in prison for murder. So even though he brutally killed his victim, The prosecutor charged him with passion provocation manslaughter, and he served 4 years in prison. Clark is now a free man, and he is goes on a speaking tour. He's a motivational speaker to tell people about his story and try to advocate for victims' rights, and he's done an incredible job. So here's a vigilante who you might consider to be moral to a certain extent, even if you disagree that maybe you think he should have been punished more, maybe you think he should spend the rest of his life in prison. His case is different than other types of vigilantes. One that would be a case that is very stereotypical of the liberal view of what a vigilante is, not heroic, not tragic, but fascist. Someone who went out of his way to commit a horrific murder, took the law into his own hands, and felt superior to others. Jeremy Moody. So I talked to Jeremy a lot, and Jeremy is actually not as one-dimensional as you might think, but he is a skinhead. He's got right there a tattoo on his neck. It says skinhead. On top of his head, it says white power. Here's a guy who has a very interesting worldview. White supremacist, unabashed fascist, and absolutely wants to murder all sex offenders. So he went to a guy's house, never met the guy, killed him, and then there was a woman there who was the victim's wife, and he murdered her too. No sympathy, no remorse at all. I apply the same 10 rules of moral vigilantism to Jeremy, and they don't apply. Jeremy is an immoral vigilante, because even though he says, I was trying to help children, trying to make the world a better place, he was self-aggrandizing. He killed innocent people. Even if you don't count his victim as innocent, what about the guy's wife? He says she was guilty by association. Well, I think most people in society would say that Jeremy Moody's role was not heroic. And in both cases, Clark Fredericks and Jeremy Moody, you would say there's not anything heroic, except in Clark Fredericks' case, triumph over trauma. That while he was sitting in his prison cell, he started to read philosophy. He started to meditate and think about what he had done, and to put his life back on track, and to take responsibility for his own actions in life. And now he's a health fitness expert. He's trying to make the world a better place. You would say that, well, where's the heroism here? One guy wanted to spark a wave of violence that would kill all the sex offenders, especially the white ones, because they're polluting the white race, versus Clark Fredericks, who wasn't really trying to change the world. He just wanted revenge for his own personal case. But he grew beyond that and decided that the way to make change is to reach out to people and help victims. Fascinating, huge differences between them. No way you can actually compare them. Then you get a guy like John Watson. John is a fascinating guy. I talked to him a lot. In fact, he and I will be publishing 2 books together in the coming years about the California prison system. John went to prison in California for killing a drug dealer. Killed him, goes to prison, and he says, all right, well, I deserve to be here. I'm a murderer. Serving his time. And while he's in prison in California, he is surrounded by sex offenders. And the correctional officers go to him and they say, hey, Watson, you want an extra food tray? You want an extra roll of toilet paper? Do you want your own single cell so you can have some privacy? If you work for us, we will reward you. So Watson says, sure, what do I have to do? And they're like, just beat up some sex offenders. We just want to punish them. And we want you to be our weapon. Because if we beat them up, we'll get in trouble. But you can beat them up and we'll say it was just inmate on inmate violence. So he became a pirate, a buccaneer, flying under a friendly flag. And he went around and beat people up all over the prison. And he beat them up really bad. And he didn't kill anyone, though. And he was rewarded. Well, then one day, the staff in the prison system, they get tired of this arrangement. He wasn't following he was not being obedient to them anymore. And they said, all right, well, we're going to punish you. So they put him in a dorm. And a dorm living in prison is the worst. Everyone would rather be in isolation. John said, put me in the secure housing unit. Put me in solitary confinement. I don't want to be around all these people here. And they're like, no, you're going to stay here. This is your punishment for not being obedient. So John said, okay, how about I give you some dead bodies? If you don't move me to a higher security level, I'm going to start killing people. And they said, well, we'd like to see you try. They didn't take his threat seriously. He wrote it out and sent it to the warden. He sent it to the governor. So John gave them fair warning. And one day he took a cane from another prisoner, walked over to a sex offender who was watching children's television show. It was called Odd Squad on PBS Kids. And he beats the guy to death, crushes his skull in. Then he goes to turn himself into the officer who was not paying attention. And on his way, he sees another guy who's a sex offender, child sex trafficker. And John says, in for a penny, in for a pound, and beats him to death too. He killed 2 people at the same time in a California prison, which is extremely rare, very rare. Except in an escape attempt or a riot, you never see a double homicide in prison. So John Watson got his single cell. They put him in solitary confinement for 18 months. And while he was in there, what he didn't know is that people in the free world heard about his case and started sending him money and sending him letters. And now he has thousands of letters from people around the world who said, thank you for killing sex offenders. You're a hero. And John said, I was a nobody. I was a guy serving life in prison. I was cast out from society. Now I'm a hero. It was bizarre for him. So he has a really important message to send to the world. He says, you don't know what these guys are like. These sex offenders are all over the place. And they're always talking about what they're going to do when they get out, how they manipulate the system, how they pretend to take rehabilitation classes so they can get out early, how the system uses them for money. And so he's just got this huge amount of information for the world on how the prison system operates and why this idea of convict justice is not what you think. You think, oh, in convict justice, people are always killing sex offenders in prison. It happens regularly. In the year 2019, I found 11 cases of a sex offender being killed in prison. People who specifically had sex crimes against children. 11 cases. And one of those cases was a sex offender killing another sex offender. So that doesn't count. But of the 10, not all of them had that motive. And you're like, okay, so less than 10 people were murdered in an American prison for sex crime justice. So the vigilante thing is overstated. It's not true. They don't kill them all the time. Mostly they go to protective custody, they pay for protection, and most people don't want to do what John Watson did. They don't want to kill somebody and then go to isolation. It's extremely rare. So a lot of the stuff you hear about on the internet is myths. But it does happen. So you probably heard of Sean Atwood, a famous YouTuber. He came to America, sold some drugs in Maricopa County, Arizona, and he went to jail. And while he was in jail, some people hounded him, the Aryan Brotherhood. They looked at his paperwork and they saw he was in for drugs. And they said, oh, okay, you're fine. You're here for drugs. Don't worry about it. We thought you're a sex offender. And he's like, no, I'm not a sex offender. And they're like, okay, good. Your cellmate is a sex offender, though. So we're going to go kill him. And they did. They grabbed the guy, took him to the shower, and stomped on his head until his brains came out of his head. Now, if you've heard of this case, you've seen it on Locked Up Abroad on National Geographic. You've read about it in Sean Atwood's book, Hard Time, or you've seen it on his YouTube channel. This is a true story. I've seen the case file. I think it was 2003, Maricopa County, Arizona, Towers Jail. So it does happen. There are also a lot of non-lethal violence that happens against sex offenders. So you've heard of Jared, the subway guy. Jared, who committed an enormous number of sex crimes against children, not just what we call, which is dismissive, a euphemism, I don't like it, but it's hands-off sex offenses, downloading child pornography. Child sexual exploitation material is a better word. It's all euphemisms all over the place with sex crimes. But Jared actually also traveled internationally for sex tourism to sexually abuse kids in other countries, and he sexually abused a 16-year-old in New York. But he was never
sent to prison for those crimes. He was only sent there for all the pornography on his computer. So, because he had a lenient plea deal, the prosecutor wanted to be merciful and only give him 10 years instead of life. So he goes to prison for 10 years, Jared Fogle. And while he was in prison, there was another guy serving 10 years, and his name was Stephen Nigg. Stephen was in there for possessing firearms. What about your Second Amendment? Well, he was a convicted felon. He was holding somebody's guns. And, well, that is a crime. It's a probation violation. They gave him 10 years. He didn't commit a violent crime. He didn't do anything. He just had a gun. So he's angry. He's going to serve 10 years, the same amount of time as this guy who abuses kids. And he's walking around. He's like the king of the prison. He's rich, and he's got all these other sex offenders following him around like he's a hero. So Stephen decides to go and just beat him up, and he did, and he became famous. So the picture I'm showing you here is Stephen Nigg in a video game, because somebody on the internet thought that Stephen Nigg was such a hero that they made a modification for the Nintendo 64, a wrestling game, where they changed the skin to look like Stephen Nigg, and then they have another skin for another character that's Jared Fogle, so that you can beat him up in the ring, because vigilantes have a lot of time on their hands. One of the common misperceptions that I even believed for a long time was that people in prison are more likely to commit murder in prison if they're serving a life sentence, so they have nothing left to lose. But that's not always true. Scotty Allen was serving a prison sentence for murder, but he was going to get out. He would have been about 40 years old when he gets released. That's plenty of time to enjoy life. There are lots of people in prison for murder who would love to get out at age 40. But Scotty Allen, even though he had a parole date on the horizon, he had a cellmate who was a sex offender. And Scotty decided that he wasn't going to tolerate that. And so he pretended, Scotty had this little scheme. Scotty, by the way, has like an IQ of 148. So he's genius level IQ. And he's a very interesting guy to talk to. But as I'm talking to Scotty, he says that he told me all about how he lured the sex offender into telling him all of, he said, I wanted to give him enough rope to hang himself. So Scotty pretended to be a pedophile. And he said, these laws are terrible, aren't they? Don't you think these laws are oppressive? And the sex offender is like, oh yeah, these laws are awful. Then he starts going on and on about his sexual fantasies with children, allegedly. So Scotty decides he was going to murder him, and he slowly tortured him to death for 3 days. Why didn't the officers find him? I don't know, but he killed him in a brutal way. And then Scotty actually is on death row for this. So he sacrificed his release date for the death penalty. Maybe the most extreme case of people I interviewed was Joseph Druce. Joe Druce reported that he'd been sexually abused by a Protestant preacher, a seminary student, whenever he was a little kid. And this ruined his life, traumatized him, set him down a path of drugs and alcohol and crime. And he went to prison for murder. So Joseph Druce is another guy serving life, exiled from society. He's sitting in a Massachusetts prison cell, and he's got nothing to live for. And he's just, miserable. Well, the guy on the right is John Gagan. John Gagan was a Catholic priest. And for about 40 years as a Catholic priest, or 35 years, he sexually abused 150 children. As a priest, he had access to children. He would sexually abuse them. And then when the church found out, they would cover it up. They told the families not to tell the police. They told them to forgive. And they didn't want to stigmatize John Gagan because they didn't want him, they wanted to forgive him. And so they sent John Gagan to a new church, a new parish. They put him in charge of youth groups in the churches because he loved children so much. And then while he would be in charge of these kids, he would start sexually abusing them again because nobody warned the families that the priest was a pedophile. So he abused kids everywhere he went for 30 years. And then in the 90s, he touched a kid in public and was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in prison. And this all came out because of the Boston Globe Spotlight team. They exposed how the Archdiocese of Boston and the Catholic Church across the United States and across the world had been covering up thousands of cases of child sexual abuse because they didn't want to look bad. I have bad news. It looks really bad when you cover it up. So John Gagan went to prison as an old man. He was harassed by the other prisoners, very common, especially because he was famous. But nobody was physically hurting him until they transferred him to the Shirley Max prison, Shirley, Massachusetts, in this Supermax prison. And Gagan goes over, gets put into a maximum security wing, along with Joe Druce, a convicted murderer who was abused as a child. You can actually watch the security footage. It got leaked to the internet by Joe Druce's legal team. And what you see is, you see all the doors in the cell block are open, and the prisoners are putting away their food trays. And then they walk back to their cells, and the doors automatically close behind them. John Gagan walks into his cell, and then Joe Druce follows him as the door closes. And as soon as the door shuts, Joe Druce put a book up in the railing of the door so that it couldn't open. He jammed it shut. Then he turned around and strangled John Gagan to death and jumped up and down on his chest. And he said it was like stepping on a cockroach. He wanted to kill him. He also brought in a razor blade because he wanted to castrate the dead body of the priest. Well, finally, the officers get the door open. They take Joe Druce out. They take the body out, and they send the body to the morgue, or to the hospital, for an autopsy. So John Gagan is dead. The autopsy crew is taking pictures, and all of the pictures of the dead body get put into the legal paperwork because Joe Druce pled not guilty. He's 100% guilty. He's on film, on camera, being dragged out of the cell after he brutally killed the guy. He's 100% guilty. And he himself said he killed him. He just said he's not guilty of killing him. So he gets a trial. As part of trial, you get discovery, which is where you get copies of all the prosecutor's evidence. So Joe Druce sent me a big box of evidence of the crime. And in that box were pictures of the dead body. And I was like, this is really messed up. I don't want to see all these like dead body pictures. You know, it's not what I got into this research for. I'm not a coroner, not a medical examiner. And so I'm on the internet and I'm, you know, gathering more research from reliable sources. And along the way, I found a website that sells murderabilia. This is a website that sells artifacts and autographs and things related to serial killers. And one thing they were selling were the autographed photographs of John Gagan's dead body. Joe Druce takes these pictures, signs them, and writes underneath there his motto. He says, "Leave the kids alone, signed Joe Druce." Sends them to the website. They sell them for hundreds of dollars. There are people across the country who are buying pictures of dead bodies signed by the killer. And that's when it really dawned on me how much people hate sex offenders. And also how, if anybody has any illusions about the morality of vigilantism, this might be one case that goes too far, even for you. This might be the type of case where you say, what do you do with a picture of a dead body? When do you cross the line? Who's on whose side? And it was an interesting thing is a lot of the victims of John Gagan, the family members, they said that they wanted justice. They didn't want murder. And they thought it was that what it had done is it actually turned John Gagan into a victim. He was a monster. Everybody in the country was against this priest who abused kids. It was all condemnation. Then when you think of him as an old man being brutally stomped on and strangled and his dead pictures of his dead body being sold on the internet, then you're like, oh, wait, he's actually a victim too. So is he a monster or a victim? I guess we could say the same thing about Joe Druce. Was he a victim, a little kid traumatized, sent down the path to rot in prison? He said, that's what he said to me. He said, why did God send me here? To rot in prison my whole life? To life in prison? to just sit in here forever? Or did he send me here and deliver this priest into my hands so that I could kill him? I was on a mission from God. So, monster or victim? Or in some cases, people would say Joe Druce was a hero. He still gets letters, birthday cards, people thanking him. So what did I do with all this research? I present a lot of case studies in the book, but I also talked about ways we could think about vigilantes a little differently. I think that there are definitely a lot of people like Clark Fredericks who commit vigilante crimes for retribution, for revenge. They were abused as kids. They want justice. They conflate justice and revenge, and they hunt down and kill the guy who hurt them or the guy who hurt their children. And there's a lot of cases like that. Then you get the ideological vigilantes like Jeremy Moody, Patrick Drum, Michael Allen Mullen, and a lot of these community vigilantes who go out, hunt someone down on a sex offender registry, and kill them so that they can make the world a better place. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because in a way, these people are radicalized by I call them in the book child protection extremists. We all want to protect children, but how many of us are willing to go to prison for the rest of our lives to kill people who hurt children? There's something a little bit different about a vigilante than the rest of us. We all want to protect kids, and that's that virtue that of protecting children that they say, I'm an extremist. By doing this, I'm virtuous. I'm signaling my virtue. I'm on a path, a quest for significance. I'm a hero. And I achieve that by killing people. And the rest of us say, I love that you want to protect children, but now you're going to prison for murder because we don't like murderers either. So now you get, it's I think we should make a clear distinction between a retributive and an ideological vigilante. Then there are people that I call pseudo-vigilantes. And these are people who commit murder, like let's say the Aryan Brotherhood in the Sean Atwood case. The Aryan Brotherhood, I've done a lot of research with gangs in prisons. I've talked to people and I've read all the research that's out there. Rebecca Trammell has done a lot of research on the mindset of gangs and how they operate, gang members, the justifications they have for killing child molesters in prison. David Scarback is another person who's written a lot about this. And then my own work, and combined together, I look at it all and I say, some of these guys are just collecting merit badges. They're like, it's a shakedown. They go up to some old guy in prison. They're like, you're here for a sex crime? Show me your paperwork. Oh, sex crime. Okay. Well, you can give me 5 bags of potato chips or I'll kill you. And the guy gives him 5 bags of potato chips. If he can't pay, they kill him. They're not really heroes. They're not vigilantes. It's just the sex offenders are friendless. It's easy to gang up on them and abuse them in prison. So they're pseudo vigilantes. And then there are other cases of self-defense that are definitely not real vigilantes either. Like there are people women who are the victims of sex trafficking. So they're being pimped out by some guy. And the guy says, I'm going to kill you if you try to run away. So she kills him. She shoots him and runs away. She gets life in prison for murdering that poor sex trafficker. Is she a vigilante? Or is this self-defense? She's escaping from a monster. It's not the same. But this is an interesting picture here. This picture is Alice in Wonderland, drawn by Jeremy Moody, the vigilante. Notice she has a machine gun and combat boots. And it looks like she shot one of the chess pieces from the story. Down went Alice, never once considering in the world how she was to get out again. So what Jeremy Moody was trying to tell me is he didn't really plan on getting caught. He thought he could just go around killing people forever. So, vigilantes are not the masterminds that you see in the movies. Andrew Vax, I've mentioned him before, is the author. He had a theory, and the theory was this: based on his experience of interviewing people who'd been sexually abused as children and the destructive lifestyles they had, that they're like bombs. A bomb can blow up and destroy itself, Suicide. A bomb can blow up and destroy lots of innocent people. That's when they commit crimes and lash out at their people around them. But sometimes a bomb is pointed at a target, like a claymore mine. It's pointed at an enemy. And in that case, a vigilante is someone who's trying to blow up, sacrifice themselves in order to take out a sex offender. And Andrew Vax used the term "a bomb built in hell." These kids who were sexually abused as children, isolated, emotionally distraught, mentally devastated, horribly mistreated. So they're set on a different pathway in life. Their cognitive development is going to take a completely different route. And if you believe that psychopaths are made by their environment, not born genetically as a psychopath, but that abuse contributes to this, to the development of psychopathic traits, antisocial personality disorder, then you'd have to agree that adverse childhood experiences are a big part of that. So they have abusive childhoods. Then the justice system fails them. They can't trust the system to get justice because the system failed them personally. It's easy enough for you to say, well, you know, plea bargaining is necessary in our conveyor belt justice system, and due process allows for this and that. And you're talking to people who experienced it, who went to the justice system, who sat in the courtroom and testified against a rapist and were called liars and sluts by the defense attorney. And then the prosecutor pleads down. Imagine the Jeffrey Epstein case where the prosecutor takes a plea bargain from multiple accounts of rape and child sex trafficking and kidnapping down to a crime that the guy's willing to plead guilty to: soliciting a prostitute. The child victim is a prostitute. The insult of the system, the second rape of the system, that devastates the child's mind. Then they develop antisocial coping, drugs and alcohol, running away from home, committing crimes. Inevitably, they're going to go to jail, juvenile detention, adult jail, adult prison. And often while they're there, they're sexually abused again. Our prisons are what Andrew Vax called sodomy schools. People get raped a lot, sexually abused in our prisons a lot. While they're in prison, they suffer loss. If they had any family that actually loved them, they might die while they're out. They're frustrated by the prison environment. Frustration, aggression, hypothesis kicks in, strain theory, general strain theory. They're frustrated. They never learned how to cope normally with stuff. So they're already people who are volatile and impulsive. And then they get an opportunity. The correctional officers, who are supposed to be capable guardians to prevent you from getting access to a sex offender that you're going to kill, they become complicit guardians. They put you in a cell, like Shane Goldsby, this poor kid who goes to prison in Washington. And while he's in there, they put in his cell the man who raped his sister. And he says, "Get me out of here. I don't want to share a cell with him." And the officers say, "No, you're going to share a cell with the guy that raped your sister." So Shane Goldsby killed him, got life in prison. So the opportunity to commit these crimes is a big part of this. But lastly, the one that I'm most interested in, because it overlaps so much with what so many people in society believe and what critics of mine, academics, who I won't get into the petty squabbling that goes on in the ivory tower, but there are people who have told me, you shouldn't write a book about this stuff because we need to get beyond thinking about retribution and revenge. The system doesn't have to punish. Punish is problematic. Punishment is problematic. I'm like, you guys are so out of touch. Do you have any idea the way that normal people talk about this? They want to kill these people. Putting them in prison for life isn't enough. Putting them in prison for 10 years, 20 years, 15 years is not enough. 4.2 years is definitely not enough. The fact that 95% of them never go to prison at all is not good enough for people. They want revenge. And nobody wants revenge more than a bomb built in hell. These kids who experienced all this stuff, and then they go to prison for stealing a bicycle, for stealing a car, for a violent crime, a property crime. They go to prison for that. But they're serving more time than a rapist. They believe in revenge and they are mad. Andrew Vax, once again, the genius who knew all this way before I even tried to write this book, who has unfortunately passed away. But if he were alive, I would not have needed to write this book at all. He said it all years and years ago. He said, ironically, when punishment is seen as nothing more than revenge, it finds its strongest endorsement among those who are most likely to suffer from it. So the people who are in our jails and prisons are people who have learned the lesson over and over again. When you commit a crime, you're punished. We have laws to punish you. You don't pay your taxes, you're going to pay. You're going to suffer. You don't, you steal a car, you're going to suffer. You're going to pay. We have a punishment for you. But if you rape a child, they'll call you a gentleman and give you a pass. They don't like that. Mercy for serious crimes violates what's called the rank order of severity. Retribution is the idea that we punish people for the sake of punishment. Now, that is not at all satisfactory philosophically for the majority of sociologists, criminologists, and law professors across the country. But those are academic ivory tower elites. They don't know what they're talking about. The people know what retribution is. Retribution is, you hurt me, so you deserve to suffer. Eye for an eye punishment is probably barbaric. We would never pass a law that says if you rape someone, you should be raped, because then you're no better than the rapist, right? But we do have laws that say you will receive a certain punishment for a certain crime. Lady Justice personifies this. So Lady Justice is the statue of the woman holding the scales and the sword, and she usually has a blindfold. The blindfold says, I don't care if you're 5'1" or 6'1", you will receive the same punishment, no matter what your height is. I don't care if you came in here in a suit and you have your own attorney, or if you have a public defender and you're wearing shackles. I don't care what your race is. I don't care if you're a DuPont heir with billions of dollars, or if you grew up in the streets and you're poor. None of that matters. What matters is your crime. What crime did you commit? So she holds up the scales of justice. And on one side of the scale is the crime that you committed, weighed down by an equal punishment. And the rank order of severity of the crime should equal the rank order of severity of the punishment. You should not get more time for stealing a piece of pizza as you do for raping someone. And yet in California, when they passed the 3 strikes law, there were people serving life in prison for stealing a piece of pizza, stealing a bicycle, or stealing a VHS tape. In fact, there are people there's a guy in Ohio who was given 1 year in jail because he said the F word in a courtroom. It was disrespectful to the judge for him to use bad language in the courtroom. So he put him in jail for 1 year. But Jeffrey Epstein got 1 year. 13 months in a stockade, and he got to drive home on the weekdays with a police escort. It is not fair. The rank order of severity is all messed up in the system. And people know this, and they get really mad about it. And so do you blame someone if you're sharing a prison cell with a guy who raped a child and he's serving less time than you, and all you had was some drugs or you stole a car? It makes people mad. They want to rebalance the scales of justice. But notice in Lady Justice's other hand is a sword. That's because punishment is a core part of our criminal justice system. What else can the system do if they don't punish you? Now, I have read a lot of stuff from criminologists who want to change the way we think about crime and punishment. They want to get away from punishment. They want to minimize punishments. They want to get rid of stigma. And this is a huge agenda. They've been pushing this for a long time. I'm not convinced. I think they make some really good points when it comes to juveniles, when it comes to low-level crimes, but they're hypocrites in so many ways. It's just remarkable how flawed their philosophy is. But the idea that we're ever going to get rid of punishments for sex crimes and go to restorative justice circles, that's what they want to replace it with, where you actually sit around in a circle and a mediator comes in and they tell the rapist, to apologize. And he says, sorry. And the victim is supposed to say, I accept your apology. And then you go separate ways. No punishment, no stigma. Never going to happen. Never. And now, this is blasphemy. I would be run out of this. They would ride me out on a rail from the American Society of Criminology if I acknowledge the common sense. But the commonness of common sense has no appeal for some of these guys. They say that we must replace our punishment system with kindness. I don't think that people that rape babies need all that much kindness. But then again, you know, I can't tell them what to think. But I will give you 5 reasons not to be a vigilante, because my conclusion is I do not endorse vigilante crimes. Despite what some of my detractors said with the book, is they said, you're sympathizing with vigilantes. Like, what do you mean? Criminologists all the time are trying to understand. Like, there's a book about Charles Manson and his sad life. There's a book about Tookie Williams and all, you know, the streets he grew up in. And there's all these books about people who commit atrocious crimes, trying to make you feel sorry for them. Explaining someone's pathway into crime does not mean that you sympathize with the crime itself. So I have 5 reasons you should not be a vigilante, and none of them have anything to do with sympathy for the rapist. The first one is, if your intentions are good, like you're a good person, you're a child protection extremist, you really want to do something, then you're probably a good person. I don't want you to go to prison. That would be bad. So why don't you do something effective that does not involve a crime? There are things you can do. You can get involved. You can go door to door. You can get signatures. You can donate money. You can become big brother, big sister. You can adopt kids. You can even coach basketball. Be one of the good guys. Be a good father to your children. You can do a lot of things to help reduce the number of crimes against children that occur that have nothing to do with you committing a felony. So if you're really a good person, don't do this stuff. You know, if I could go back in time to these guys, I would tell them, don't do it. Even the guys who are serving life in prison, I'd say, yeah, don't commit these felonies, please. There are other things you can do instead. Vigilantes relieve public frustration. So think about this. Those of you who are vigilante supporters, you're like, you watch Gary Plauché memes. And as you're like, there's a song, it's like something in a small town, try that in a small town. They play it over video of Gary Plauché shooting Jeff Doucette in the head. If that is funny to you, if you spend your time on these memes, then you must care a lot about children. You must really want to protect children. You've gone so far in signaling your virtue that you're a good person and you want to protect kids. When was the last time you ever actually did something for a kid? When was the last time that are you trying to get a job in child welfare? Are you trying to be a police officer, a lawyer, a doctor, a counselor? Are you donating your time? Are you donating money to a charity? Are you even voting? Do you know who your local judge and your local prosecutor are? Oh, well, that would take time. You'd have to look up the name of the judge and see what their sentencing practices are. And oh no, and then people are lazy. So there's a judge in Ohio. Her name's Judge Julie Lynch. She's a Democrat. She is so tough on sex offender crimes. She takes it very seriously. She's so tough. But I know people in Ohio who say, well, she's a Democrat, so I'll vote for the Republican. The Republicans are the ones on the appeals court who overturn her harsh sentences. So it's not a Democrat-Republican thing. It's not a conservative liberal thing. Look at what the Catholic Church did. They're considered to be a very conservative organization. Can you think of anything more conservative than the Catholic Church? But they covered up sex abuse crimes. Where are all these crimes happening? The Boy Scouts? Is that the most conservative place on earth? It's not liberal conservative. It's nothing like that. You have to do a couple of minutes of research. If you can do a couple of minutes of research if you can watch an hour and a half video of me talking about this, or read a book, or post memes, I think you can spend a few minutes to investigate the fairness and the proportionality of sentencing that goes on in your local court district. When's the next election? Do you even know? Most people have no clue. You're not a participant in democracy. but you have a pressure release valve. You're really frustrated about these crimes, but if a vigilante does something funny, then your peace of mind is cheaply bought. You're cheaply bought, and so you're fine. You're not going to actually get off your butt and go vote. Okay, you're not part of the solution. You're virtue signaling on social media. Number 3, violence actually gives an excuse for leniency. So there are judges who said, I won't send this rapist to prison because he's not safe, because the prisoners will kill him. Well, in my research, I found that, yeah, they do face a lot of violence, a lot of risk. A lot of that's because the wardens and staff facilitate it. They're complicit in abuse. But the number of murders is pretty low. It's about 10 per year, and it's actually less than that because the motives don't always align. So it's not that's not the issue. But the other thing is, like, the sex offender registry. Most people say they don't want to get rid of the sex offender registry. I think it's useless. So a couple reasons. Sex offender registry is not associated with reductions in recidivism or sexual recidivism. And that's been pretty well known for decades. So it's a failed program. Number 2, it gives the government an excuse not to do their job. They get to put a hazardous warning sticker on somebody and say, hey, don't go near this guy. He's a rapist. He's dangerous. This Matteo Condalucci guy, he's dangerous, but we're not going to keep him in prison anymore. So we're just going to release him to the community. But he's on the registry, so it's not our fault if he rapes again. They're abdicating their duties to protect society, and the registry gives them an excuse to do that. There are 900,000 people on sex offender registry in America. What good is that list? All it does is give you a false sense of security. So you're like, oh, well, I can drop my kids off at summer camp because they do a background check. No one who works there is on a registry. Well, the majority of rapists never even get reported. So yeah, they're going to be the whole summer camp could be full of rapists who've never been caught. You can't trust the registry. But the one thing that will get rid of the registry is vigilantes using it to hunt people down in their houses. So vigilante violence is counterproductive from the point of view of people who support registries and incarceration sentences. Number 4, the victim of the vigilante, so the sex offender, might be innocent. And I did find some cases where someone was falsely convicted, incarcerated due to police officer and prosecutor misconduct. They just wanted to close the case, and they found some homeless guy and said he's the rapist. And the victim said, that's not him. And they said, you're too young to know he's the rapist. She's like, no, that's not him. Doesn't even look like him. Doesn't sound like him. And the guy who raped me had a dog in the car. That's how he lured me in the car, was with a little puppy. And the police are like, oh, no, the victim, she's too young to know. So this is the guy. They put him in prison. Wrong guy. The real rapist was out there kidnapping and raping more kids. And they finally caught the real guy and let the other guy go. And that guy's life was ruined. And I thought, what if he was murdered in prison? Imagine that, to be falsely accused, to be sent to prison, and then to be murdered. Like, it's just, the system is not, even with due process. This number 4 here does not really work if someone is a retributive vigilante, because in that case, you're attacking somebody who you know for a fact abused you. So people who kill their fathers, killing Jeff Doucette, Gary Plauché case, the Clark Fredericks case, they're killing people who they actually knew were raping. So that doesn't really apply. But the last one is, it won't restore the victim. I never met a vigilante who said that they were mentally restored. They're like, okay, so I killed a guy, and now I feel like my work on this planet is done. Like Michael Allen Mullen killed himself. The guy in Maine killed himself. All these prisoners, they don't feel any better except they get letters and money in the mail. But they all feel terrible. And a guy like Clark Fredericks, he had to turn to philosophy to feel better about himself. It wasn't the killing that made him feel better. It was thinking about his life differently, taking a different outlook. But my co-author absolutely is the perfect example of this. This is a man, Jason Vukovich, who grew up in Alaska, and his stepfather abused him constantly throughout his childhood, and was even found guilty in a court of law over it, but he got probation. And Jason was returned to his custody. So Jason ran away from home, lost his family, lost his chance in life. He had a lost childhood. And Jason hated the man who sexually abused him. He hated the society that protected the rapist. He hated the court system. He hated the teachers and the coaches who saw that he was covered in bruises and they never did anything to help Jason. But most of all, Jason hated himself. He blamed himself. He thought about, what is wrong with me? Why? And he turned to drugs and alcohol. And for 40 years of his life, he lived in the misery of self-loathing and hatred and animosity. And then one day he went out, looked at the sex offender registry, and he found 3 guys who had committed sex crimes against children. And he went to their houses, slapped them around, stole their stuff, and left. So it was robbery, aggravated robbery. And in one case, he hit a guy in the head with a hammer. Didn't kill anybody, but pretty serious crimes, especially because he had a lot of criminal history points that he'd racked up in petty offenses, credit card fraud in the past. So now Jason is at his lowest point in life, and he goes to prison, or he goes in front of the judge, and he tells the judge, he says, I'll serve 12 years in prison, because the 3 guys I attacked, they were all supposed to serve 3 years in prison for each of their separate crimes, which should have probably been 20, 30 years each for what they did. And then my stepfather was supposed to serve 3 years in prison. So that's another 3. So I'll serve all of theirs back to back to back to back. And I'll plead guilty to these crimes. And the prosecutor and the judge were outraged. And they said, we don't negotiate with violent criminals. They wanted to give him 27 years in prison for these crimes. And their justification for this long sentence was, we do not tolerate vigilantism. And this prison sentence demonstrates to the people of Alaska that we don't tolerate vigilantes. What does it mean then when they sentence a rapist to 3 years, 1 year, or house arrest, and they call him a gentleman and give him a pass? Does it mean that they tolerate rape? Because Alaska has some of the most messed up problem. I have a whole chapter in the book about Alaska and their sentencing practices. It's bad. It's really hypocritical. It's a complete inversion of the rank order of severity. And Jason was sentenced to 27 years in prison. He'd get out with good behavior. He could get out after 10. So he's in prison now. He helped me write this book. He gave me a lot of feedback. He helped explore each case one by one. He also contributed several sections at the end of each chapter to tell his story piece by piece, and then culminate in the final chapter, which is his advice. Did beating up these guys with a hammer make him feel better? Did it take him from a violent vigilante to did it restore him? Did he overcome his trauma through violence? No. He overcame his trauma sitting in a prison cell and thinking about his life and realizing when the letters came in the mail, and he got a letter from Australia and Germany and all over the United States of people writing him and saying, Jason, you're a hero. Thank you. I wish someone had done for me what you did when you beat up those guys. So they're rewarding him. They're telling him what he did was good. And he says, that's not the message he's getting from the letters. The message he gets is, I wasn't alone. I thought I was alone all this time. I thought I was the only one. But the world is full of people who were sexually abused as children. People who were let down by their families, let down by the justice system. And they're all out there. And he got a sense of community. And he actually felt connected to these people through their shared trauma, through their shared experience. And so he came up with a therapy program for people who've been sexually abused. And it's the stages of grief: loss, hatred, and you get indifferent sometimes. Sometimes you accept it. You can learn from your experiences. But peace, true peace, comes from teaching, helping others. And he writes letters, very diligently writes to everybody who writes to him. And he writes them back and says, love yourself. Don't blame yourself. You don't blame yourself for what you did or didn't do when you were a kid, that you didn't go to the police sooner, or that that these things happen to you. People prey on children because you're not cognitively developed, because you're not socially connected, because you're not powerful. They took advantage of you, but now you're an adult. Learn from those experiences, protect others, be part of the community, and then you can finally feel peace. It's an incredible therapy program. And what I think is brilliant about Jason, who's a very smart man, much smarter than me. The best thing about Jason is when he gets out of prison, he needs to go on a tour like Clark Fredericks. He needs to go around as a motivational speaker and provide therapy to victims. Probably he would speak really well to male victims of child sexual abuse, but also women. Because think about this. Let's say you got a guy in Florida and he's been sexually abused as a child. And let's say he's 45 years old and he's been drinking, he's divorced, his life's a mess, and he's never, ever gotten over the trauma. And he's full of hatred and indifference and back and forth. He's in a volatile state. He's a bomb built in hell. He might blow up and kill himself. He might blow up and kill somebody else. He might want to be a vigilante. Maybe he's typing on the internet right now, aha, the Alaskan Avenger, the vigilante. I wish I could do something like that. Maybe he's like all these other people that I talked to in the book. But Jason could say to him, you're not alone. You need to teach others. You need to help the community. You need to protect other children. Find a strength inside yourself and a strength from the combined community. Now, if a therapist said that, if I said that to this guy in Florida, if I said, you just get some therapy, man, and, don't be violent, it's just empty words. He doesn't care what I have to say. He doesn't care what a therapist has to say. And he doesn't trust the justice system, and he doesn't trust anybody, because trust is the first thing that a rapist takes away from you, is your ability to trust others. But he can trust Jason, because Jason is a man who, through his actions, showed that he was a traumatized, abused person, and that he was somebody who cares and understands the rage and the frustration and the desire for retribution that is dismissed so easily by academics in the ivory tower as uncivilized or whatever. But this guy in Florida can trust Jason. Jason, when he gets out of prison, will be the best advocate for helping the victims of child rape overcome their trauma and abuse to go on to do good things and live life to their fullest. And he learned all that in his prison cell, which I guess means that prison has some benefits for people, but it can be overdone. I think 10 years is a bit long for what he's done. So like I said, my book is called Avenging Child Sex Abuse, Vigilante Violence in Prisons and the Community. It's written by myself and Jason Vukovich. It is an academic book. About 5 chapters are a lot of literature reviews. I've done some statistical analysis, charts and graphs. But then the other 5 chapters are case studies. So I go in depth on the cases, like Joseph Druce. I tell the whole story. I've got references in there for different news articles and places that you can find more information if you want. So I think that the book is useful to a lot of people. But just in case you're not interested in reading the whole book, you don't want to buy it or read it, I understand. So I started a free Substack. Substack is a newsletter. I don't understand it. I don't know. I don't want to do, it's not paid subscriptions, so you don't have to pay any money. But in the newsletter, I summarize chapters. So you don't have to go through all the details of the academic literature. I just summarize the points, give you all the information you need on Substack. Also, if you really want to make a difference, don't give me money. So if you want to support my research, I don't accept donations. I don't sell things. Even if you buy the book, I get $1 per book. So I'm not going to make $1 million or anything. I don't care if you buy the book or not. What matters to me is that if you want to make a difference and you want to donate money, is I'm going to put a link to 2 charities in the description to this. I'm not affiliated with these charities, but they're the 2 best as far as I can tell. One is the Legislative Drafting Institute in Child Protection, which was started by Andrew Vax before his death. And what this does is it tries to provide lawyers to kids who've been abused so that they can get proper legal representation. Most states don't give a lawyer to little children. They give them a court-appointed special advocate, which does not even have to have a law degree. And the kid doesn't have any idea what's happening in the courtroom. So I think that LDICP is the best charity. And the other one is the Child Rescue Coalition that looks into child sex trafficking. And if you could donate $5 to them and it makes you feel good to donate, I would be happier knowing that you're giving $5 to one of those charities than if you post memes. Posting memes, I read a lot of them. I studied them for the book. I understand people's rage and frustration, but I don't know. I think a lot of people are diffusing or dispersing their rage, their energy into social media when they should be directing it to real life. So be good to the children in your circle of trust. Let them know that they can come to you with anything, that you can help them, that you will help them make reports, you will protect them, you'll keep them safe. And we have to stop this at the source by protecting little children. Then we wouldn't have to worry about all the problems with our ridiculous criminal justice system if we could stop it before it happens. So take care of the children in your life and take care of yourselves. Thank you.